Our second scripture is from the Epistle of James, chapter 1, verses 17 to 27. Every generous act of giving with every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. In fulfillment of his own purpose, he gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits of his creatures. You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. For your anger does not produce God's righteousness. Therefore rid yourselves of all sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, and welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. But be doers of the word, not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those folk who look at themselves in a mirror, for they look at themselves and on going away immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. If any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Religion's having a hard time these days. We all know scores of people who would describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. I would bet that during Cheryl's days as a hospice chaplain, you probably heard that more than any other descriptor. Oh yeah, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. The fastest group of religious preference on every survey in the United States is, fastest growing group is none. None. Mainline churches have been in decline for decades, with people voting with their feet that the mainline church has become irrelevant to their daily lives. Conservative churches had been growing, but in the past decade, they began to decline as well. And that decline has increased significantly in the last 2 years, especially in white evangelical churches, as that swath of American Christianity has identified itself more and more with the GOP and with Donald Trump. Judaism's a little trickier to get a handle on, as the definition of who is or who isn't a Jew is up for interpretation. But we do know that synagogue attendance is down. And in large degree, it parallels what's happened in the Christian church, with the more mainline synagogues feeling less and less relevant to daily life, and the more conservative ones identifying more and more with the right wing and finding themselves more and more out of touch with younger generations, and all of that in Judaism complicated by the role of Israel in everything. Islam is the one religion that's growing in the United States, but it's not growing because of converts. The data seems to indicate that while, yes, there are a lot of folk who are converting to Islam, there are an equal number leaving as converting. So the growth is coming in large degree from new immigrants to the United States. And indeed, if you looked at Christianity, you would see the same thing there, that our decline in Christian churches would be even larger than it is if it wasn't for new folk immigrating to the United States and bringing Christianity with them, or coming from some other faith group and trying to find a sense of community by joining Christian churches. A Pew survey shows that we're not unusual in the world. Recent Pew survey has shown that younger generations especially are abandoning institutionalized religion all around the world. And that if you look anywhere they've studied, that millennials are less likely to go to church than their older counterparts. Then you add to that, here back in the US, the complexity of people's schedules, the way things have changed. It used to be that Sunday was a time when you could go to church. Now, if you have young kids, as likely as not, they've got some kind of a sporting event that might be the only time you have to do housework, or if you're one of the blessed few, to put your feet up and have a quiet evening reading the Sunday paper or playing games on the web. Add that we as Americans especially like to customize things, and we like to figure out just what it is that I want to believe. So we'll take a little bit from Hinduism here, a little bit from Buddhism there, a little bit from Christianity here, maybe some Jewish family traditions. We'll mix that all together and add a little bit of animism and maybe some Wiccan stuff, and that is what I believe. Try to fit that into an institutional anything, and you quickly find out you just don't belong, and so you don't. I read a definition some years ago of religion that came from David H.C. Reed that I think speaks to some of this. He was a Presbyterian pastor of Madison Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City, one of the big pulpits where important pastors had their ministry. And he was there for 33 years, beginning in 1956. So he was there during that time when the mainline church was just thriving. And he had influence in what the mainline church was. And this is what he said. "This then is what I mean by religion. The humility that leans on God for the direction and guidance for our life. The integrity that acknowledges Him in all our ways, and a basic trust that He alone knows the way we should go and can provide the inner strength, forgiveness, and refreshment that all of us need. This, to me, is basic religion." When I read that so typifies what the mainline church believed and preached during that period of time. And while it's okay as far as it goes, I read that and I think, yeah, so what? It just feels kind of milquetoast, you know? There's nothing there that would inspire someone. It's nothing there that would make somebody go, yes, that's what I need. And I think in large degree that's why people left the mainline church. They said, oh yeah, so? And how does that impact anything in my life? And especially, why does that make me want to get up on Sunday morning and go listen to somebody talk to me? Saying things that I either don't want to hear or don't have anything to do with my life. Well, beyond that, I think James, the writer of our letter today, would hold that definition in disdain because it is entirely internal. You could agree with everything in that, live religiously according to Reverend Dr. Reed, and nobody outside would know it. Nobody would be able to see any difference in your life made because you were following that definition of religion. James would say this feeling-based religion, this intellectual religion, this theoretical, even doctrinal stuff is fine, but it's meaningless if it's not reflected in the way you live your life, if it's not reflected in your daily actions. James says, show me your faith without actions, and I'll show you mine by my actions. Now, This letter of James is an interesting one in the history of the church. You may recall that Martin Luther, one of the great reformers of the church, referred to it as an epistle of straw. And there have been times when some have argued that it should be removed from the Bible. The reformers stood firmly on this idea, and it really shaped the church from then on, of faith alone being the way that our salvation is found. They stood firmly on that idea, and biblical texts that seemed to, or in the book of James' case, firmly came out in contrast to that, were not worth the paper they were printed on. As Luther implied, made of straw, burns really nicely. And James himself was a controversial figure if we read the scriptures. He was in conflict with Paul over the requirements for Gentile believers. James, the brother of Jesus, was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and in large degree, he seems to have seen Christianity as an extension of Judaism rather than something separate. To become a Christian, James would have said, you also have to be a Jew. And that put him in significant conflict with Paul. And if you read this letter to James, in the context of this conflict from Paul, you can really see it as his letter arguing back against some of the things that Paul had said. But James himself was also an interesting figure. He gets mentioned by the primary historian of that part of the world at that time, Josephus. And Josephus says that James was held in high regard even by the Pharisees because of the way he lived his life. Early Christian documents show deep, deep respect for James, again, because of the way he lived out his faith. And it gets reflected in today's scripture because they said one of the things that was most admired about James was the way he cared for people in need. And so he writes this letter in the context of all of that. It's unclear exactly who he was writing to, but it is an easy guess, and I think a fair one, that at least in part he was responding to Paul. And when Paul talks about being saved by faith, James argues back, yeah, but if it doesn't show in your daily life, I don't want to hear about it. If it doesn't make a difference, it doesn't matter. Now, it's true that James was concerned that these new Christians meet some of the ceremonial requirements of Judaism. He might even have agreed with those who complained about Jesus in Cheryl's reading. It's why aren't you washing your hands? Why aren't you observing a kosher kitchen? Why aren't you doing all of these things? Perhaps James went as far as requiring circumcision of new Gentile adult male believers, which you can imagine most of them said, well, I don't know about that. As there were deep religious and cultural differences between Judaism and the Gentile world, and many of them the Gentiles would have looked at and found unreasonable, circumcision, silly, why not eat bacon? It's really good, and even bizarre. To whatever degree all of this was background stuff for the letter, it's interesting to me that James doesn't list any of that stuff. He doesn't say, this is religion, that you do this and this and this and this. He doesn't say, this is religion, that you believe this and this and this, like many modern Christians would, even from the Reformers on. Go and look at any church's website, and one of the first things you'll find is, this is what we believe. James doesn't care. He doesn't care at all. Instead, he's concerned in this letter really with just two facets, with the life together, and that's in large degree exemplified by his extended talks in this letter about bridling one's tongue. But even that is secondary to his primary concern. And that's just in that last verse of the scripture I read. Pure, undefiled religion is this: caring for widows and orphans, and keeping oneself unstained by the world. I want to focus on caring for widows and orphans. And the first piece that jumps out at me is the notation that James doesn't say caring for Christian widows and orphans. He doesn't limit this requirement to his own community. He says, that's not a piece of it. You take care of these folk. And then the second piece that really struck me is that to whatever degree we still have these places, these folk, and obviously we still do, they're not the same slice of society as they were at the time of James. At his time, a child with no parents was on the street, likely didn't live very long, or if they lived very long, were picked up by someone whom we would now term a human trafficker and sold into slavery. That would have been the best that could happen. Obviously, that's not what happens with orphans in our world, is it? Indeed, if you happen to fall into the right categories of orphan these days, you're a hot commodity. And lots of folk looking to adopt and care for. A woman in James' time without a husband had no means of caring for herself. She couldn't own property, she couldn't have a job. If her children wouldn't care for her and take her in, there was no safety net. It was a dire, dire situation. And James, in this passage, is saying, you become the safety net for both of these categories of people. For these folk who are literally on the edge of life and death, sitting on that knife edge each and every moment, it is your responsibility to be there for them. Our society has changed enough that those really aren't the issues. Human trafficking we still have, but it's not quite the same as it was in those days. Safety nets, yes, they are constantly under threat in our society, but we still have them. And so it becomes difficult to translate this passage across the centuries. Most folk would agree when they read this that the first thing we do when we translate it is that it speaks not literally about orphans and widows, but about those folk who are on the margins still, with no means to care for themselves or limited means, for our folk without houses, for those who are unemployed, for those who are disabled, maybe even sometimes for those underemployed, for folk who struggle to get adequate food, housing, reasonable health care. That's who it leans towards. But then the next piece that's hard with it is who is responsible to do this? And those on the right read these passages and they say it's an individual responsibility. It's my responsibility. It's your responsibility, Barbara, to take care of these people. It's your responsibility to see they have what they need. The individual is called to help. And so if I'm the one who's called to help, I get to decide who receives the help, when and how and where and what reasonable ways to do it. And we have programs around us that seek to do that. We've got Unity Shop, we've got Laundry Love, we've got Transition House, we've got the shower trailers. Maybe some of us even still carry blessing bags in our cars, and we find somebody standing at the intersection waiting. We open our window and hand them the bag that has a few things in it. And those are ways that we show our individual concern and our individual commitment to help. Those folk who are on the left look at that and say, no, that's inadequate. It's inadequate. Because these are systemic problems, and systemic problems require systemic answers. It's good to do those things, but if the system was set up as it should be, we wouldn't have to. If the system was set up as it should be, we wouldn't need to have transition house, because people wouldn't find themselves, families wouldn't find themselves without housing. We wouldn't have to have the Unity Shop, because people would have enough to eat, and they wouldn't have to go and wait in line there to get food. And systemic problems that require a systemic response, well, that equals government. That equals government. And we see that to some degree as well. We have Social Security. There was a time not that long ago in our history where elderly folk were the most likely people to live in poverty. Because if they lived past their working life, they had little or no income, many. We have Medicare, because those same elderly folk, well, the commercial insurance companies didn't want to insure them, because they get sick. They cost a lot. And because of all of that, they either wouldn't insure them at all or wouldn't insure them at a reasonable amount, and so those folk had more health problems and no way to deal with them. And the government stepped in and said, you know what, we're going to take care of this. And likewise for poor, very poor folk and for young children in poor families, Medicaid. We had unemployment insurance and disability insurance. Unemployment insurance because we have a society and economy that requires people to be out of work. You know, when the unemployment rate gets below a certain point, the economists start to get nervous, because that means there's nobody to cause pressure there to keep wages down, even though they seem to have figured out how to do that anyway. And so they require, our economy requires people to be out of work. So we've said, well, if we have to have some people out of work, at least for a little while, we're going to help them out. Beyond that, they're on their own. But for a little while, if someone loses their job, for whatever reason, and disabilities likewise. People get disabled, we've got to be able to help out with that sometimes. We have Section 8 housing for people who can't afford housing, which is becoming more and more the case in so many parts of our country. But we all know these programs aren't enough. Walk down State Street and you'll see they're not enough. Look at the statistics and you see that the number one reason in the United States for bankruptcy is still medical expenses. I think you all know where I am on the right to left spectrum. That's an easy one. That systemic problems require systemic responses. And I think that James, I would argue that James would say that our call as people of faith is to work for more spending, not less, on all of those things. For health care for all, for reasonable educational programs available for all, for Social Security that actually is enough for people to live on, for Medicare and Medicaid that really meet the needs. Maybe some kind of single payer, but at least 100% health care availability for all people. I would argue that if James was writing this today, he would say, pure religion is this: work for economic security for all, regardless of age, race, religion, or ability. And economic security includes all of those other pieces. It includes adequate food, it includes adequate housing, it includes access to medical care, it includes the opportunity to find ways to grow and utilize one's gifts and make a meaningful contribution. Oh, and also stay unstained by the world. I would expect that if we asked him what that meant today, he would say, that means we reject the values that place oneself above others. I think that's what pure religion is today. And I would bet that if we in the church, if those in the synagogues, if those in the mosques lived that more intentionally and more visibly, we'd see a lot fewer people saying, oh yeah, I'm spiritual but not religious. We might even find some people, some of those nuns who are saying, yeah, I'm religious, but I'm not spiritual. And I'm not sure that would be a bad thing. Indeed, I think James would say, sounds good to me.